Bible Smack. Alright, today I'm going to be looking into an issue that really, I'm addressing an article that happened probably about 5 years ago. But I think this is essential for what's going on now. We're starting to see the fruits of this. And this is kind of something going on in Southern Baptist life, but it's also infecting other forms of evangelicalism. And what it is that now we have people in churches kind of becoming part of the social justice movement, which can also be called cultural Marxism. And what it is that Marxism is basically where we get the philosophy, where we get socialism and communism. And changing the culture to adapt to a communist society is on their platform and agenda. And so they've been working on this kind of stuff for many years, and I've seen records, for instance, the USA Communist Party, their platform and agenda was put forward to Congress back in the very early 60s. And in that agenda, they talked about pushing for feminism and the feminist movement, but also that they were going to start a homosexual movement. And of course that has come to place. And most of the things on that agenda have come about in history. So as that's going on, you have the counter of the conservative movement among Christians to kind of regain. And so the Southern Baptist Convention was the largest Protestant denomination in America. I don't know if it still is or not, because it has gone downhill. So, at some point some other denomination is going to surpass them. But basically, we have seen a massive decline in our churches. Well, politically, we know that there was a huge sweep after during the time of Barack Obama and a push. And basically, once the Supreme Court gave in on the issue of gay marriage, and they barely gave in on the issue of gay marriage, but Obama had stacked the deck with the Supreme Court. So once that happened, what you had was this push, this just decided to force in these cultural Marxist values, and that is destroy sexual identity. Up until that point, one of the leaders in the evangelical movement for biblical manhood and womanhood and sexuality and all that kind of stuff was Albert Mohler. Now, I went to Boyce College, which was the undergraduate program of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I got to meet Albert Mohler on many occasions, and to the level that he could, at least at that point, identify me. And I think I called into his radio program a couple times. It sounded like he was familiar with my voice. But regardless, we had some different platforms, and he was working with the groups from Focus on the Family. And basically, I remember coming up to him and talking about the issue and just having a heart to kind of reach the lost and reach, homosexual people or whatever. And so at that time, even his facial expressions, just knowing the man, he was just unflinching. He was just, this is it, and it's kind of like, hey, I'm going to be professional, but, it's like, ugh, But basically, they had some talk about counseling, and he also spearheaded a movement towards biblical counseling, and that was good. So everything was kind of moving in this direction. And different therapies with homosexuals and stuff to help them to get that point. Now, there was a thing, I'll call it a rumor. It involves a story with Albert Mohler, but he's not the main character. A friend of mine at the Bible college told me this, and he said, oh, well, this one guy, he's like a hardcore Calvinist, and he went up to Mohler and he started arguing for some sort of gay gene or whatever. And Mohler kicked him out and called him a flaming hypercalvinist. I don't know, but I'm personally convinced that did happen. But I don't know, because as I said, this is a friend, and I'm not putting that forth like to say, oh, this is what happened, but, I think it happened. Nevertheless, so that was kind of where things were at then. Then around 2014, I think, he's got a conference and he starts talking about how he needs to repent of some of his attitudes about homosexuality. Now, when it comes to the issue of homosexuality and evangelicals in the pastorate, I will admit this. There is too much of an obsession. Homosexuality was an easy sin, and so they decided they would rail against that sin to get themselves credit. Okay? Basically, like, oh, I'm against sin. Let me tell you, I'm against homosexuality. And so that was pretty often. I once sat under a preacher who just, it was pathetic. It was just, they'd want to hit that topic and hit that topic and hit that topic. There weren't any gay people in the congregation. And, they're like, oh, yeah, and I can nuance it, and do this and do that. And I was like, why? Okay. Once you start emphasizing the one sin, then the other sins kind of, oh, well, we're not going to address those things. And, I know this for a fact that, there are people who would rail against that, but they wouldn't dare address the issue of certain people living together. Okay. So all of a sudden, fornication took a back seat, like, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, fornication and waiting for marriage was a big deal. They were getting that value out there, and you saw people like Rebecca St. James, yeah, we're waiting, and you just don't see a lot of people waiting anymore. It's no longer a thing. And, so this is what happens. Not only do you get that going, but then you also get a backlash anyway, because you keep on telling them, don't do that one, but don't do that one, but don't do that one, and then they did everything else, and then they eventually do that one. Okay. So I do think that it's true that the overemphasis has at points, backfired. I think about Matthew chapter 23. And he talks about the woes unto the Pharisees. And, let's see here. It says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you compass the sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Woe unto ye, blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. So this is, even though they'll say, like, I'm against this, I stand for the truth, so I'm against this one sin, that's actually a sign of worldliness and fleshliness, and sin. All sin is sin. And when you have pulpit time, you should focus that on going through the scriptures and going through them all. Okay? And as you start to hit on every sin, but also hit with grace and love, then what happens is that they have a growing spirit, and a growing spirit is more powerful to take on an issue than legalism. Okay? And part of that legalism is exalting one rule to the exclusion of others. Now, so there is a part where Mohler is, correct to kind of say, all right, hold on. But then he also goes into this thing where he is saying that, homosexuality is something that's like brand new. No, it's not new. Now, the categories are new, and the categories are not accurate, and that's going to be one of his problems. But let me hit this real quick. The book of Jude. It says, Jude verse 3, it's only one chapter. Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it is needful for me to write unto you and exhort you that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. For there are certain men crept in unawares, who were before of old ordained to this condemnation, ungodly men, turning the grace of our God into lasciviousness, and denying the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. I will therefore put you in remembrance that you once, though you once knew this, how that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, destroyed them that believed not. And the angels, which kept not their first habitation, but left their own, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness and the judgment of the great day, even as Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities about them in like manner among them, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. So here he is going through all these Old Testament examples of sin. He's like, this is not new. Okay, the issues of sin are not new, and just like Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, they have twisted things with the category. When the Bible talks about Sodom and sodomy, it is not equivalent as the definition of homosexuality. But it's the homosexuality classification that really screws this up. Okay, it's the one with the error. Sodomy is sexual lawlessness. Okay, and while it is marked noticeably with that issue of homosexual behavior, it is really a lawlessness and regards all sorts of perversions. Okay, this includes rape and molestation and prostitution and whatnot. In fact, it also includes demonic possession. Okay, when we kind of see what's going on with them wanting to have sex with angels. But basically, if it's just an individual who is struggling, like if a guy is struggling with feeling effeminate, then when the Bible has big declarations about homosexuality, not homosexual, when it does about sodomy, and says, okay, these guys who are raping dudes and raping girls and, doing all this stuff, well, they get the death penalty. Well, basically, that is a different issue than, there's somebody's having some effeminate thoughts. Okay? But what you see is that these things are like diseases. And I can get like a cold. I think right now I got allergies. But anyway, I can get a cold, And that can do some things, but then I get over it. But yet that thing can grow, and there are certain people that didn't die of pneumonia. Okay? So it's like that. The sin infests and it grows, and, there's different levels of things. So, there is sometimes confusion, sometimes by the church, a lot of times by the secular world reacting to the Bible, okay? Because they have decided to go out and slander the Bible, so then they, cause confusion. The other thing is this issue where Mohler then goes on to talk about how this is a result of the sinful nature. And now we have to have these categories. People are just born with homosexual affections. So with him citing that people are born with homosexual affections, he's really backtracking, and he repented of his previous teachings. And scientifically, there's still no gay gene. There probably will never be anything like a gay gene. Why? Because those are not physical issues, they're mental issues. Oh, well, this guy wants to speak with a lisp. Oh, well, this guy has fashion sense. How are you going to have a gene that makes you pick out certain clothes? Especially when they're different ensembles. That's psychological. That is not physical. Okay? And, they'll have these things, and I go, those are stereotypes. Well, it's all a stereotype. Why? Because it's all psychology. Psychology is not a hard science. Okay? I'm not talking about how it's like hard intellectually. I'm saying that it's, it's not experimental, fact-based, pure this, pure that, okay? It's, in art, almost. But basically, Mohler kind of goes in this direction. Yeah, and what did the old Mohler say, at least, from this tale, okay? The old Mohler was against that, and he called it hypercalvinism. And it is. Now, do I think that this is truly his motivation, is that his theology got deeper and he became a hyper-Calvinist? Well, I will make an assumption, and it's just an assumption, but it just seems to make sense. Mohler has the most powerful seminary in the country. And he's influencing the biggest denomination. And it's all 501c3'd and messing with the government. And this is under Obama, before Trump comes in and says we're going to squash religious persecution. Which, by the way, he's only done temporarily. But basically, what we see is, I look at Mohler and I look at where the SBC is, and I know how in the past the SBC was predominated by those who were in the Freemasons. Not only is it predominated by these Freemasons, but also they've gone back into hiding, and they were never kicked out. There was a resolution made in the late 80s, early 90s, and then hordes of Freemasons protested it, and that was it. It was just done. So, what was Mohler's attitude about the Freemasons? Well, I've listened to his Albert Mohler program, and he said, well, there are some pagans, but, there are some Christian Masons, and it started out as a Christian organization, and just leaves it alone. That's it. He didn't say anything after that. So, I look at this stuff, and I have an understanding that there is a form of New World Order out there, okay? And being that, I believe that, I see things. At the seminary, they were having theological debates. These were big, giant platform shows. And basically, when they were having these debates, they had a group come in and give them financial backing. And that group was called the Acton Institute. And not only did they have the Acton Institute, but they also had a lot of funding from two different groups. Most of the money, when it comes to funds, was coming in from either UPS, which is a big labor-run or a labor union-run organization, or with some oil companies. Okay. And basically, my feeling is, so I'm still in this world of speculation, my feeling is that they were getting a lot of funding, and then you have this Acton Institute. What's the Acton Institute? I looked it up years later, and it was a political conservative group, which a little bit off, but you think, well, maybe it's because they're a Baptist political conservative group. Nope. Roman Catholic. Why is a Southern Baptist institution needing money from a Roman Catholic group to do a Baptist theology presentation? Baptist theology in a Baptist seminary needing a Roman Catholic group's funding. So we hit this stage. Mohler has set himself up as the ultra-conservative. Mohler came from a more liberal background, though. He was part of Southern Seminary back in the 80s, and he did work for a woman, I forgot her name off the top of my head. She was famous, though. And basically, this woman was in charge of missions, and she was a Universalist. Okay. So, Mohler originally, he was neo-Orthodox, and he just studied Karl Barth, and he started studying Carl Henry, and then he ended up taking a turn to become conservative. And then he props himself up over the issue of marriage. Now, his theology, Reformed theology, was not the dominant theology of the Southern Baptist Convention. And some of his roots with that theology are not traditional Baptist. Okay? There are Calvinists that have always been in the Baptist church, but they would call themselves particular Baptist, because there's a lot more to theology than just the 5 points of Calvinism. But he's actually reaching out, and he's getting some people who really don't have roots in the SBC in their teaching. And as he kind of comes in, he starts bringing in all these Southern Baptist students who are conservative who wouldn't go to the seminaries before that, and then starts getting them into the Reformed theology. And then what he does is he's got himself propped it up on this issue of marriage. Him and Wayne Grudem and John Piper, and they'll talk about the traditional manhood and womanhood, and he goes all out for it. And then he just backs off, starting at that point. Starting with things like, what was it? He gets away from the conversion therapy. He gets away from all this Christian psychology for that, at least. But he's still promoting himself. So in his promotion, even though he's had to do this, and why? Probably because I'm going to bet you that money would have disappeared if he stayed as conservative as he was. And he might have had some legal issues, too, coming at him, assuming that a Hillary Clinton would have been president. But then you see these other movements. You see his right-hand man, Russell Moore, takes over the ethics committee at the SBC, and he starts making controversial decisions. He says, you know what, we've got to fund this case in New York to get these Muslims and to help them, and that might have been New Jersey, but anyhow, to help out these Muslims to build a mosque, we need to fund their lawyers. Well, in terms of religious liberty, yes, we believe the government shouldn't be forcing religion on anybody or stopping the religion of anybody. That's true. But it doesn't mean that we need to shell out gospel money from our group and our contributors and say, well, the gospel money needs to go to build a mosque. Alright. A little bit different. He could have just said his piece and that would have been fine. Made a couple public statements. Say, go, freedom. But no, he made a big deal about that. And then you had these retreats and dealing with homosexuals and Christian homosexuals as this stuff starts going on. And then, when it comes election time, well, there's two things. One is Mohler ends up going with the more liberal side of the Republican spectrum. Okay, they did a lot of work with Michael Medved. I first got into it. I was probably a lot more politically moderate at the time, but basically I got into it first by them building up Michael Medved, who was a Jewish neoconservative. Then, come election time, 2008, our first major conservative Southern Baptist minister presidential candidate. It's like, wow, this is a slam dunk. Okay. And my ADD's acting up. What am I thinking? Huckabee. Okay. Huckabee runs. And what does Mohler do? It's like, a Mormon in the White House? We need to go for Mitt Romney, and I'm there for Mitt Romney for economic reasons. Economic reasons? Mitt Romney. Okay, the guy who came up with Romney Care. Alright. The guy who said that he had nothing to do with Reagan and Bush and that he was pro-choice. And he suddenly at the end, oh, well, now I'm pro-life. Mormonism, a faith that Mohler had publicly said is not saved. And during the primary, he's saying, don't vote for Huckabee, vote for Mitt Romney. A couple election cycles later, Trump is running. And he's like, this guy is a philanderer. You don't want to vote for that guy. Now, if we're talking about the primary, I could understand that. And I ended up not voting for Trump during the primary for that reason. But his economic policies, I knew from the start, and in my studies, they were going to be better. They were going to be good. A couple things I disagreed with. I'm not into the spending that Trump does, but, basically I was like, this is the right platform. But when I hear Mohler speaking out, he doesn't speak out during the primary. No. He's speaking out against Trump when Trump is going to take on Hillary Clinton, a socialist. When the decision was made for in favor of gay marriage, Russell Moore gets on there and he starts talking, well, we're just going to believe what we believe and we'll move on and we'll get through this. But then he gets on to the Michael Medved show and he says, look, this is not going away. We won't be dealing with this for another 50 years. You're going to tell me on year one that you're going to fight this, but you're planning not to win for 50 years. So, basically what I'm seeing is that Mohler has to justify his actions. Okay. And so he gives a theological justification for his actions. And what's problematic with that is that it's one thing to say, I failed, I messed up. It's another thing to say, not only did I not fail, but I'm going to make God on my side. Okay? Let's look at the book of James. Take me a second here. Alright. James chapter 1. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil. Neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth a sin. Sorry, not a sin. It bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift of every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variance, neither shadow of turning. Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of firstfruits of his creatures. So, as they're saying, well, no, there is a sexual orientation, and people are in this and people are in that, and he's like, well, little kids, or all these adult homosexuals say they started feeling this when they were kids. Well, the old Mohler would have responded that children do not have a set sexuality, and that it's good parents that help promote that child to help them to understand what their sexual identity is, and then move on from there. So when the homosexual has these things, they're not in a position where their roles, or their sexual roles, are being firmly ingrained in them. Now that happens two ways, one of which is the parenting. But the most popular way in which homosexual behavior happens is through molestation. And there is a statistic, 86% of homosexuals can recall a time where they were sexually assaulted and molested. And I've had to counsel homosexuals, and, you know, it's horrible. I mean, I knew a dude who was like molested when he was like 3 years old, and he was functionally retarded for years. And it kind of came out, and, you know, ended up messing with other groups, and I've seen that happen repeatedly. But here's the funny thing. I've seen people get out of that. Okay? Oh, no, it's born into you. Well, it was born into you. You can still change it. Right? But basically, these are not by nature of that. Now, sexuality is, you know, your physical body has sexual sensory. And the physical stuff is physical stuff, okay? You might go into the shower and all of a sudden feel good. You might have a good breeze. Oh, yeah, it feels good. You know, something rubs you the right way. Okay, well, you know. But basically, that physicality has to be programmed by the mind, by the soul, and the spirit. You build up your spirit, you get your soul right, you get your head straight, and then you do what you should do, not what feels right. Okay? And as your spirit grows, then you get more power to have more self-control. Mohler is basically projected hypercalvinism. He's projected the doctrine of hypercalvinism. And I believe he's projecting that doctrine not out of theological conviction, but he's projecting that out of compromise. And basically, what's happened is that you have all these social justice issues, all this communism that's being put in place, and all this liberalism has creeped its way back in. And so I think that once you start saying things like, well, God has made people to be evil. He's made people to not believe. And, God's got a good will, so maybe evil's not so bad in some sort of God sense. So, we have to have some sympathy for the devil. And once you start that confusion, then that's going to confuse sexual roles. And so there's Russell Moore hanging out with Beth Moore, and Beth Moore is starting to get all into it now. I mean, she used to be really conservative, and now she's just out there railing and saying, hey, we need women in power, women's rights, we gotta go against misogyny, and Mohler can complain all he wants, but he's the one that opened up that dam, okay, because he did that, and then he bore the fruit. Good for you. Let few of you assume to be teachers. And I'll be honest, I'm not tempted on the level that he is. I have definitely made much more conservative stances, and I've taken more sacrifices. But that's because I didn't have things. And I'm at a time in my life where I need things. Now, I'm not telling you that I'm going to compromise, but I'm going to tell you right now, I understand. I will be more tempted than I was before. And he is probably a lot more tempted than I ever had to be. But basically, this is why we have to be careful about power. Okay? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Meanwhile, Mohler has also had other behavior issues. When Paige Patterson, okay, I remember at seminary, he was called like the modern Martin Luther for bringing inerrancy back into Southern Baptist lives and getting things arranged again. Mohler decided to go ahead, and when he was attacked for giving bad advice to a girl who was apparently sexually assaulted, and him telling the girl to forgive the guy who was supposed to be in ministry or whatever. Basically, what happened was Paige Patterson was instantly fired, but his side of the story was never really let out too much. Okay, and this is like an incident out of having to work nonstop for decades. Okay, so he might not even remember it happened at the time they brought it to him. But basically, they used that to spearhead it. And so when they kicked him out, they replaced him with people that were under the tutelage of Albert Mohler. And Albert Mohler went public and talked about how God was judging us. Okay? In other words, he kicked him to the curb. And he took over power of the Southern Baptist seminaries and influenced it with his theology. And under influencing with his theology for the last 30 years, okay, please understand this. You look back at the 1970s, the seminaries had been infiltrated horribly. Many of the seminary doctorates were already becoming atheist, okay? I knew a woman who was the daughter of a preacher, and she was with the Southern Baptist, and she was a Unitarian now, okay? I had met her back in the 90s. But anyhow, basically, this was just, that was horrible, but the conservative churches just wouldn't go to the seminary. And their turnout of baptisms and evangelization pales. I mean, like, well, maybe not pales. Ours pales in comparison to them. They baptized more people then than 30 years later when the population has grown massively. Okay? We still didn't baptize as many people. If you didn't just for inflation, they really just totally knocked us out. Okay? But now that Mohler has gotten all these Baptists to come to the seminaries, there are teachings like limited inerrancy or original autographs onlyism that were not permeating through the conservative Baptist church life. Okay, they may have had some hold, but they had hold among the liberals. Okay, now they've got that promoted, and so everybody's into their new versions, and everybody's altering their Bibles. Like, but that's the way it is. Mohler said it. They don't believe that there's such a thing as an inerrant Bible on the face of God's green earth. So liberalism has come in and taken over anyway. And so now we just have this slow slide. But this is kind of how this stuff is going. The Catholicism has had to entrench into Southern Baptist life. They did through the liberals. Okay, that's a longer story, but basically they were already influential that way. But the new Calvinistic movement is now entrenched. For instance, Russell Moore then goes to his big marriage thing. He's the champion of marriage because he says, we're going to refuse. That's what you're saying when you say this is not going to happen for 50 years. All right. And he's like, yeah, so now we'll get together with the Catholics. Catholics have different beliefs about marriage. They believe that it's a sacrament. And in fact, the way they do marriage is that the marriage has to last forever because it's a sacrament. And as a result of it having to be that way, they allow for prostitution. You know, how's that better? But basically, you know, Russell Moore's like, yeah, so we agree on marriage. I don't want to know what's going on in his life, but he thinks that's the same thing, right? Yeah. You go to all these Catholic countries, and that's what you see. I mean, the Catholics in America might behave a little bit better because they're around Protestants, but you know, that's the pattern, okay? Because you can't divorce, okay? So you just got to put up with it. And, you know, you hang out with, you know, I've hung out with some Mexican people, and that's what I'm seeing goes on often. Not that they all do, you know, and I don't want to see anybody, you know, in that kind of lifestyle. But, you know, I mean, these are the realities. So then why was Russell Moore really over there if it wasn't that they truly agreed? Why is Russell Moore going to the Vatican? See how this stuff all works out? Basically, remember that Jesus Christ is the head of the church, not a denomination.